countries. And in fact, today, as we gather for this webinar, we do so with a great sense of purpose and of urgency, cognizant clearly of the challenges and opportunities that the multilateral trading system holds for all of us. The system, especially now, faces trying times, grappling with numerous challenges. Amidst these challenges, we also recognize the immense opportunities that are presented, particularly in the realm of the digital economy, as firmly confirmed during the 10th ministerial meeting of the WTO here in Nairobi. As stakeholders, it's imperative for us to harness these opportunities while remaining vigilant to the obstacles that confront our system. I think obstacles that all of us are quite familiar with. So in view of our crucial role in these conversations, TNIF organized this webinar to highlight some of the crucial interests of African countries at the upcoming MC13 that will take place in Abu Dhabi. Subsidies agreement with a plan to initiate a second phase, a second stage. While several countries have ratified this agreement, it's essential that we, as TNIF, together with all our partners and friends, delve deep into its implications and impact for Africa and on African developing economies. Another pressing matter that needs to be addressed is the plastics solution dialogue text stemming from the negotiations that were held here, again in Nairobi in 2023. The issue of fossil fuel also holds increasing significance, particularly in the context of development versus climate change action. These three interrelated topics underscore the intricate relationship between international trade law, sustainable development, and climate change mitigation. The Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, a product of MC12 negotiations, as I said, is a milestone in international trade negotiations. Already 60 members have deposited instruments of acceptance, including 7 African countries. The agreement signifies a collective commitment to address the challenges posed by harmful subsidies in the fishing industry. The overarching objective of the agreement is clear. It's to curb the detrimental effects of subsidies on overfished stocks, while also tackling illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing practices. As we anticipate phase 2 negotiations at MC13, it's imperative that we pose critical questions that will hopefully shape the future trajectory of these discussions and negotiations in Abu Dhabi. Firstly, will there be a robust prohibition on subsidies contributing to overcapacity and overfishing, accompanied by a comprehensive list of subsidies deemed to perpetuate these practices? Secondly, how will members strike a delicate balance between providing special and differential treatment to developing and LDC countries, while ensuring that exceptions do not dilute the effectiveness of the rules? As we ponder these questions, it's essential to reflect on the outcomes of COP28 and the capacity of the multilateral framework to address these challenges. Hence, I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists, Ms. Colette, Dr. Jody, and Ms. Yeva, who will provide invaluable insights into all these pressing matters. I'd like to close by urging all of us to participate effectively in today's discussions and to contribute to shaping African perspectives on the multilateral framework. Your insights, your engagement is invaluable as we collectively navigate the complexities of international trade law and chart a course towards a more sustainable and inclusive multilateral trading system. So, Janet, without taking any more valuable time, I want to welcome you again to the webinar, all of you present, and hand over to our moderator, the amazingly talented Janet Macharia, to kick off the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Amina, for setting the tone with those wonderful opening remarks. Hello, everyone. Allow me to attempt to give a brief introduction of our panelists today. Before I do that, allow me to highlight two preliminary points, even just speaking out of the tone that have been wonderfully set by Ambassador. And let me just begin by highlighting that while our distinguished panelists will address specific topics, I think that it is essential to recognize the broader landscape of issues that impact African interests, even though they may not be directly addressed. So I can highlight the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, which has brought to the forefront significant challenges and questions regarding ability of the WTO to settle disputes. The question here being whether members can make meaningful progress in addressing concerns that have been raised regarding the functioning of the appellate body. Could also highlight digital trade and the joint statement initiative on e-commerce, where there's an opportunity for nations to make commitments in digital trade that will benefit members as they increasingly embrace the digital world. While highlighting initiatives like the AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol that give avenues for strategic alignment with continental goals. And so these are just some of the key issues, and our panelists will address others, and we hope that we can have a broader discussion with the participants in this webinar after the panelists have made their presentations. And I begin the introductions with Dr. Jody Thiel, wonderful partner of TNIF. Dr. Jody is a senior research fellow with the International Economic Development Group at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, experienced trade economist, project manager, worked with multiple governments across the developing world to secure their trade policy outcomes. She has published several journal articles with chapters on the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, etc. Even on reflections of COP28, which will be the focus of our discussion today. Next, I will introduce Yeva, who is a senior policy advisor at the IISC, had a long career in negotiations with at the WTO, chairperson of the WTO Committee on Subsidies and Countervailing Duties. She has worked a lot on the area of trade and development with a background in international relations and diplomacy, as well as political science. Ms. Yeva, it is my pleasure to introduce you to this wonderful participant. And last but certainly, and last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Colette. We have, I hope that everyone can hear me. Okay, I'm back, thank you. We have Colette, a founding director of Tulip Consulting, Geneva-based boutique, advising public sector stakeholders on trade and environment development nexus. She's also a visiting lecturer on international economic law at the Graduate Institute, and will be addressing the Plastics Dialogue Coalition today in our conversation. So without further ado, allow me to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Jody, to begin the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. Indeed, I'm really delighted to be here. Excellency, really pleased to join you all this afternoon. So what I'm going to do is just kind of come at this discussion really from the perspective of some of the climate change negotiators that I've been talking to at ODI. So firstly, my name is Jodie Keane. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at ODI, and I sit within the International Economic Development Group. But within ODI, we're quite fortunate that we do have a team of climate change, a climate change team, and then within that we have negotiators, some negotiators who are actually at COP28 and at the kind of coalface, if you like, of those climate change negotiations. So when I sit down and I talk to them, you know, about what's happened at COP28 and what they kind of, the trade related issues that that arise in their discussions, it just strikes me that this gulf between what's happening in the climate change discussions and the UNFCCC compared to what's happening within the WTO, this gulf is really growing. I would say there's quite a huge gulf there. So as we know, at COP28 there was the first ever trade day, the first ever trade pavilion, and so everyone was really quite optimistic and enthusiastic about this. You know, the WTO Secretariat was showcasing a lot of the work that they're underdoing. This includes in relation to action on climate and trade, this new initiative with the World Bank, with the World Economic Forum and with the WTO. So thinking about how nationally determined commitments, the role of trade within these, and how climate change can be mainstream within trade policy and so on. So lots of optimism, given that we had that first dedicated trade day. You know, it saw the highest level engagement across the big institutions. You know, it did pick up on issues around carbon pricing. The discussions, you know, were picking up on these key issues. And as we know, even the adoption of the agenda for COP28 was held up by discussion about unilateral trade measures. So, you know, trade was at those discussions, but it's just unfortunate that the converse is not true. So as we look ahead to MC13, you know, I think that whilst we will see some kind of reaffirmment of existing commitments, we're unlikely to really see that much on the climate side. And that is, of course, you know, partly related to how the WTO operates, but it is also symptomatic of some of the broader challenges that the institution does face at the current time. So as we know, at COP28, we had this really important outcome in terms of fossil fuels. So it was the phrase, the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era. This is the term that is used to describe the outcomes of COP28. So, you know, as we look to MC13, what can we expect on fossil fuels, addressing harmful fossil fuel subsidies? Not much. You know, we're likely to get an update of what's happened within the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions. Another update pretty much similar to what we had at the last ministerial. So we really do have this big gulf developing, and I don't want to be too critical, of course, because there's no lack of goodwill, and we've seen some really important work coming out from the Secretariat and, you know, from the Trade and Environment Division and so on. But amongst the membership, the pace of deliberations on these issues is still really quite painfully slow. And we've got a kind of a difference in approaches as well. So whereas under the UNFCCC, there's a strong commitment to multilateralism and so on. Within the WTO, we can see when it comes to the issues around the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the EU is kind of doing the rounds in terms of discussing with members, ensuring WTO compatibility, but really bringing out the discussion around carbon pricing, border measures, trying to multilateralize these discussions. That really hasn't taken place just yet, even though countries like China have put in proposals. And this is concerning because, of course, businesses and supply chains, they are adapting now, and governments need more guidance. It's not just about WTO compatibility, it's about how to navigate this new emerging landscape, not just being reactive but being proactive to see how links to the broader agenda on carbon markets can be made, all with a view to supporting kind of the resilience of supply chains and enhancing the ability to use trade as a means to adapt. And of course, this adaptation imperative is really very, very pressing indeed. There have been discussions, informal discussions on industrial policy, which is great, and it's likely at MC13 that we'll see a proposal from the Commission to launch structured discussions on this aspect, and that's of course great. But it's coming kind of years after the announcement of these big policy measures like the Green New Deal, like the Inflation Reduction Act, which are affecting supply chains now. So this is really quite a concern. So this leads me to what I think just a couple more points I'd like to make, just in terms of the process of negotiations on trade and climate. So as I mentioned, there's the focus on the plurilateral approach, the trade and environmental, the TESSD. But as we know, there's only a handful of African countries that are party to those discussions. And the issue around plurilaterals, this is also quite contentious at the moment. There has been some progress within the Committee on Trade and Environment in relation to energy transition. And that happened towards the end of last year as well. And that's great, but it is still coming like 10 years after the Paris Agreement. And it's still hard to see how issues around competition will feature within those discussions. And these issues are really important in the climate change arena. And this is what those negotiators are really, really focused on. The final point I want to make is that, we know that unilateral green trade measures are affecting exporters in the developing world now. We know that African suppliers are being dropped from supply chains. We've heard of examples in Ethiopia for coffee exporters because they can't prove that their coffee hasn't contributed to deforestation. So these measures are kicking in now. So I think it's really important that we look out for what's included in relation to aid for trade in the outcome document. So I'll be watching that space very, very carefully indeed, given that there is this critical need for trade-related adjustment and support, given the impact of climate-related trade policy now. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jody. And I'm going to call Eva, who, sort of like pick up from where I left off, particularly on the question of fossil fuel subsidies, which is, like you said, very, very crucial. So I'll just invite you, Eva, to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Janet, and welcome everyone to this excellent event organized by Janet and Ambassador Amina, whose dedication to multilateral trading system is proved again and again. So I think this optimism is definitely needed. I think Dr. Jody just mentioned the fact that while the fossil fuel subsidies made it to a recent COP statement, the factual expenses have increased very significantly. For example, the new OECD and IEA data that covers only 82 but major economies show that fiscal cost of global support for fossil fuels almost doubled to $1,481 billion in 22, growing from $769 billion in 2021, because governments have been instituted measures to offset exceptionally high energy prices. The OECD inventory of support measures for fossil fuel estimates that direct transfers and tax expenditures amounted to $427 billion in 2022. This analysis also shows that there is a revival of support for coal production and consumption, next to the increases across petroleum, electricity, and natural gas sectors. So we generally have seen the rise of government support across every fossil fuel sector. And it is not only linked to the methodology of calculations. It is clear that governments worldwide have been almost forced in the face of energy crisis to show support for their populations. However, we also should remember that we have had many commitments in plurilateral, multilateral fora related to fossil fuel subsidies. We know that there has been, the first agreement was struck in 2009 in G20, which already spoke about medium-term rationalization and phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that are encouraging wasteful consumption. So there are many soft words around that. That was followed by the 2009 G7 commitment to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. There was a commitment in APEC, and we are also know that fossil fuel subsidies is part of important negotiations on trade and sustainability agreement that's undertaken by several countries, known as ACTS negotiations. Having said so, there have not been so many actions to match all of those commitments. We know that under the G20, some peer reviews have been completed for United States, for China, Germany, Mexico, Indonesia, and Italy. Argentina, Canada, India, and France have committed to do those reviews, but this is kind of where it ended. G7 set out a phase-out date for 2025, but we have not seen a lot of happening, and this is why a lot of members are looking at the fossil fuel subsidies initiative at the WTO. That is admittedly the smallest initiative of 3 environmental initiatives. It's combined of 48 WTO members, of which, of course, 27 are EU member states. It has been launched in December of 2021 and has held 4 meetings since. So it's even not the most active in terms of meeting activity initiative. However, it has been doing very useful work, looking into 3 particular areas, looking into the potential to bring more transparency in terms of both environmental impact, but also trade impacts of fossil fuel subsidies of WTO members, of looking into what happens when energy crisis demand support measures, what impacts and design features those programs have, and whether there are good practices to be shared amongst members when facing such situations. And 3, I think that members were really ready to go and dig into the much better details about the types and categories of fossil fuel measures, thinking about the pathways of actually phasing out some of them. And this work has been going quite successfully. I think that the members by this point have reached the decision that will be sealed at MC13, and that will start delivering much more on transparency, both from the members of initiative themselves, but also through the questions and questioning our members in the WTO's trade policy reviews of other members, as well as really using the data collecting by our international organization, asking Secretariat to provide better reports. But as we know, transparency is not an action. And the action pillar seems to be moving towards activities that will follow after MC13, in particular, looking to establish the guidelines or best practices or set of recommendations for members in the situations where we are applying government support in cases of energy crisis, looking into how more transparency can be brought in those situations, but also how those measures should be introduced, how they should be reviewed, how they should be phased out after their objective has been achieved. And of course, starting to look into the different categories of fossil fuel subsidies and drawing pathways for the reform, looking into better targeting, looking into measures that have the greatest impacts on both trade and environment. And actually 2 sectors have, I think, so far been singled out by the participants. which of course are not the finite list of sectors, but members were talking about fossil fuel production. And members have been talking about plastics. I'm creating a segue for Colette to jump in here. What does it say to us is that those activities will probably draw a clear line between the measures that are targeting the poorest populations, the social support measures, the measures of, if you want, measures of necessity, measures such as support for kerosene or support for basic transport needs, for public transport needs, between those that are really supporting the behavior that is balancing between environmentally harmful and uncompetitive in terms of international relations. And what it says for many African countries is that there is also the potential of this work to bring a little bit more justice into international trade and environmental system. If we will see the countries that are the biggest polluters and biggest spenders in terms of their industrial policies, finding a way to phase out the subsidies that are harmful in both ways. Where do the African countries find themselves? None of the participants, to my knowledge, of the initiatives are African countries, but this is an important conversation for the African countries to be following. The discussions might also provide a good set of recommendations related to the better targeting of government programs that will probably be relevant to the African countries who will be looking into the optimization of the resources that they can spend for their own government support. Our institute has for many years worked on the energy policies and energy programs in different countries, including through our presence in countries like Indonesia, India, and South Africa. And that has helped us gather a lot of institutional knowledge about better targeting, better adjustment, more social and development and justice in terms of fossil fuel subsidies. So I will probably be stopping here. I already mentioned plastics. I'm sure that Colette will bring us to the plastic verse.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Eva, for that, and also for laying the groundwork for Colette to come on board and begin her part of the conversation. And we'll have the dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade document. So I'm just going to leave it to you, Colette, to just introduce the subject, and then we can just move to Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Nice to be part of this panel, and congratulations for setting this up for the new Center on Trade and Investment Initiative. It's really nice to see those new centers emerge. So I'm Colette van der Ven. I run Tulip Consulting here in Geneva, focused on the trade, development, and environmental nexus, and how those three elements can better connect. And I am going to talk about the I was on something on fish earlier this morning, the plastic pollution dialogue and prospects for MC13. So what I'm going to do is first give a very quick overview of why we're talking about this in the trade context. And then I'm going to walk you a little bit through what is on the table right now. There is a revised, there is a draft text on plastic pollution that's currently being developed, and that will be discussed at MC13. What is in that text? Is that what members were hoping for? What are the implications of that? And then finally, I will be turning it to the African side of things and looking at potential implications of for the African continent, African countries, etc., with regards to the plastic pollution dialogue that's happening at the WTO, and taking it a little bit beyond that as well. So now, why are we talking about plastics and plastic pollution in the context of trade? I think that's a question that requires to be elaborated on a little bit, especially, and Jody mentioned it already in her remarks, but especially because there's a lot of players in this field, and the WTO is one of them. But of course, it's not the only one, with the Basel Convention, with the UNEA and the Plastics Pollution Treaty that's coming up, and a variety of other multilateral environmental agreements that are dealing with plastic pollution in different ways or forms. Now, the reason this is being discussed within the WTO is because of the role of global experts of plastics, and global expert of plastics that basically, well, it plays a big role. Just some figures here from UNCTAD. Global experts of plastics or goods made from plastics have more than doubled in value since 2005, passing the 1 trillion benchmark in 2018, and reaching nearly 1.2 trillion in 2021. Now, these are empty numbers, but if you were to visualize this, this would require 18,400,000 trucks, right? Big kind of trade container trucks to carry all this plastic that's being exported globally. So this is an enormous amount of plastic. And what are we talking about here? It's everything from children's toys, electronic gadgets, packaging products, plastic waste, products that have, textiles, polyester, things like that. So it's really a very wide variety of different products that include that plastic. It's not just plastic as, a material as such. And this in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem. However, where the issue comes in is that 75% of these products become waste. So they're not recycled, they're not treated after life, they're basically just discarded and end up in landfills or get incinerated or end up in oceans, become waste. So that is the big problem. So of course, with most of that plastic coming into a country through trade, trade is a big part of the discussion here, because when plastic becomes weight, it has threats to the environment, human health, sustainable development, and it can also negatively impact economic sectors like fishery sectors, tourism, agriculture, etc. So this is something that urgently needs to be tackled. And where the WTO has come in is that in the 2021 ministerial, it had a ministerial statement on pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics. This was a plurilateral, so it comprised just a subset of the members. Initially, it had a handful of African countries, Cabo Verde, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Gambia, and Morocco. And basically what this ministerial statement did was set out a roadmap identifying key issues to better identify how trade can not just be how basically trade in things like single-use plastic, etc., that contributes to this problem can be addressed, and how trade isn't just a lever that generates more plastic pollution, but can also be part of the solution. So in the roadmap, that focused on improving transparency of plastic trade flows in supply chains. That's actually a very big problem in plastics, because as I was mentioning, what kind of products with plastic do we trade? As you saw from that list, a lot of it are products that have embedded plastic. So you don't necessarily see the plastic coming into your country, especially if that product has an HS code that doesn't mention plastic. Right, it says it might mention something completely different. So there's a lot of lack of data on where and how plastic comes in. So one of the elements in the roadmap focused on improving transparency, including by looking at the ways in which plastic trade is happening and how we can better understand where it's coming in. Then other elements included strengthening regulatory cooperation with other bodies. So here again is that question about what international organization or organizations are addressing the problem of plastic waste, and how do all these different initiatives link together? And that is also a very important and challenging question, because if you take, for example, the Basel Convention, the Plastic Waste Amendment that was passed, I believe, in 2019, that basically sought to regulate trade in plastic waste. And for trade in, if you will, hard to recycle waste, so really plastic waste, you would then have the importing country and transiting countries that would have to give consent for that waste to be coming into the country. And only for a small subset of plastic waste considered easier to recycle, essentially, that procedure wouldn't need to be triggered. Now, that is from the Basel Convention that seeks to regulate trade in hazardous wastes. But on the trade side, or the WTO side, trade is listed, or trade products are listed in the harmonized system, where to help custom officials identify what product is coming in, they have different product categories developed based on end use mostly. So if you were to have different categories in the HS code on different kinds of plastic waste, depending on their ease of recyclability, but that is not physically visible, that is not something that's currently being differentiated in the HS code, because these two systems don't fully align. So this is, and this is not a question specifically highlighted in the statement, but this is something just to note in terms of the difficulty of bringing together different approaches to regulating trade in plastic waste, and which organization is doing what, and making sure efforts are aligned with each other. And then there were some notions of identifying best practices, sharing experiences, and also strengthening technical assistance for least developed countries and other vulnerable players. So that was essentially the roadmap that came out in 2021. And since then, different work streams have been developed, focusing on different issues, including, again, transparency, technical assistance, trade and waste management, technologies, reuse and recycled plastics, plastic substitutes, as well as how cooperation can reduce single-use plastic. Interestingly, in the statement from MC11, there was some text that said, we will look for concrete, pragmatic, and effective outcomes on these actions and understandings at the latest by MC13. So there is a bit of pressure with MC13 at the door. And this is essentially the context in which now there is a draft statement, a draft ministerial statement developed for members to further discuss at MC13. And just to give you some of the highlights there of what is in that draft statement, there is, interestingly, there's a clear reference to the United Nations Environmental Assembly Resolution 514 to end plastic pollution, and the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee that is basically working on developing an internationally legally binding instrument to tackle plastics. So those efforts that are happening are recognized in this draft ministerial statement, again, to make sure that organizations are mutually supportive and collaborative, and not, going into their own individual silos. And there is, again, an acknowledgement of Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, and there are references to basically the step-up activities and adapt voluntary measures to combat plastic pollution while these negotiations are happening. So not just sit around and wait until something happens in the other fora as well. And then there's an agreement of list on shared principles. And they're a little bit on the vaguer side, which typically can be expected from these statements, but focus on trade-related actions, deepening cooperation and collaboration with the international organizations, the other ones again, and it includes also the ISO, the International Standards Organization, as well as some others. And then deepening cooperation to address challenges of vulnerable developing countries, more transparency, and then a list of actions that again focus on a variety of issues between transparency, capacity building, cooperation on trade to end plastic pollution, etc. And so interestingly, there's also a reference to the statement comes with a compilation of different in different areas where the members have made different submissions and have identified issues of importance that they want to work on going forward in a bit more detail. So that's about a 12-pager or so that comes with it. And there is a reference to saying that this compilation should be updated periodically to reflect members' approaches to this, ideas, as well as new scientific information and outcomes in other fora. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, what's on the table for MC13 on plastics. Now, where does that leave Africa? And that's really, I think, the focus of this webinar. What are the implications for the African continent? And of course, when we say Africa, we all recognize that there is no such thing as one Africa, and different countries have different approaches. But in the interest of the topic, so plastic pollution generally is really a big problem for the African continent generally. And it has currently projections basically increased that plastic waste will increase 6 times by 2050 compared to 2019 levels. And that is reflecting the economic growth on the continent, because the more growth, the more plastic use, the more material use, etc. And that also, I think, contextualizes the problem, because plastic creates plastic waste with all the problems related to that, but plastic is also very important for the economy, as well as for the poor and vulnerable in different countries that cannot buy the full bottle of shampoo and buy a sachet with a little bit of shampoo in it, which is made of plastic, right? Or in countries that don't have water purification systems, where you cannot just go have a glass and go to the tap like you're in Geneva, but you have a plastic water bottle. So there's a lot of challenges. It's not just a question of going through removing the reliance on plastic. It's about how that can be better managed, and the waste can be better managed. So basically, in terms of African participation in this plastic dialogue, out of the 76 members that have signed on to it, right now there's 8 African countries that are co-sponsoring the statement. So there were the initial 6 countries I mentioned, including Angola and Mauritius. Basically it's 8 out of 54, 55 countries. So there's a lot of African countries that are not co-sponsoring this. And it is, because it's such an interesting topic for many African countries, it's actually could provide a space for countries to identify specific challenges related to plastic, as well as opportunities, and make sure that their specific issues are reflected in these discussions going forward and are plugged in, especially in the continued the continued discussions that are happening, and that their input is taken into account when technical assistance is being brought up, because technical assistance, of course, is broad. It doesn't mean much. It needs to be given a concrete shape, and where exactly that assistance needs to come. That is something that question needs to be answered collaboratively with countries that could benefit from it. And I know there's controversies around participating in these issues from the development angle and others. But what I think is really interesting is this document that the African group submitted in June, the principles guiding the development and implementation of trade-related environmental measures, where they set out different principles to make sure that the development angle isn't forgotten in trade and environment discussions. And I think some of the principles highlighted there could be further elaborated on within different thematic specific or theme specific discussions, such as plastics, for example. So there might be some scope there to advance some more concrete approaches on how this could help address these problems from the African side of things. And there, of course, when you're talking about plastics, it goes much beyond what's in the statement right now. We're inevitably getting into issues such as customs capacity to differentiate between different types of plastic coming into a country, substitutes for plastic, and also how to basically develop the relevant infrastructure to manage plastic waste and to set up such a system. And some of these issues could be areas where African countries have a comparative advantage. For example, some plastic substitutes that are bio-based. There are a lot of those that will be opportunities that could be further developed in different countries. So there could be a lot of ways in which this might be a starting point to further think about the connection between trade, environment, and development, and what is necessary. But I wanted to also just point out, if I have another minute or so, that of course what the plastic dialogue at the WTO shouldn't be driving the bus on where priorities are for a specific country. Ideally, it should start at a national level where a country has a roadmap, a trade development environment roadmap, but also a specific one to address the problem of plastics. And not only how plastic pollution can be addressed from an environmental angle, but also how plastics and plastic recycling could become an industrial opportunity, industrial policy opportunity. Jody mentioned briefly this industrial policy potential outcome at the MC13, but of course, industrial policy is critical in all of this because of the need to, while addressing climate issues, at the same time build economies still and alleviate poverty. So that cannot be forgotten. And there are opportunities to do this simultaneously. And I think that is really where a lot of advancements can be made, identifying where there is a win-win-win. And just an example of that, I did some work with the World Economic Forum and Ghana and their plastics approach back in the day, 2-3 years ago. And they have a national plastics roadmap where they really looked at how all of this could play out. And one of the ideas that was explored in conversations with different stakeholders was, could there be a, for example, regional plastic recycling hub, say in West Africa, that could then feed recycled plastic into, say, car industries that are emerging, you know, as an input. So you can create linkages between different industries and use the materials to build that up. So, and that's just one example, but there are many ways in which this could happen. Then there's also an important role for regional trade. The African Continental Free Trade Area should not be forgotten, and how that can be proactively leveraged to get what the country needs to address this problem. So everything from encouraging investment in the right industries, getting the right services, because you need lots of different kinds of services to build up the plastic waste management. Also an enormous amount of finances is going to be required for that. So how can regional trade agreements come into the picture? And also in terms of standards, how can standards be harmonized so that trade can be facilitated? Because that's another issue that isn't really happening right now. And then just to finish, one final element I think that's important is the coherence in policy making. So you have a lot of African countries that are doing incredible work on plastic waste management, like say Kenya and Ghana, and they're not they're not co-sponsoring this ministerial statement on plastics, but they are active in the ongoing dialogues at the UN. So there are a lot of countries that are participating in one stream of work on a particular issue, not on another, and that might have, say, plastic waste management as a domestic priority, but aren't reflecting that in their negotiating priorities, for example, within the WTO. And that is a very curious phenomenon. On the one hand, it reflects siloed policy making, like we experience in all countries where there's a Minister of Environment and a Ministry of Trade, and they don't talk to each other, so they might not get the message that this is important. It also reflects, of course, limited capacity generally. If you have a small developing country that's in Geneva very often covering the WTO and the ILO and the UN, then there might have to be decisions made on where to go, to what discussions, what negotiations, and where to have where to have inputs, and this might then not be a priority. But these are, I think, some issues that should be perhaps discussed in more detail, how we can go from the specific to then the more general, and how countries can adopt a more proactive and holistic response to these critical problems that includes the WTO, but isn't limited to what's happening at the WTO.
Thank you so much, Colette, for first of all setting the things so well. And at this point, even as I say what I want to say after, I will ask the participants to get ready to ask questions. We are at the Q&A stage at this point. So the only thing that we will ask is that as you do the Q&A, as you ask your question, perhaps an introduction, who you are and where you're based, etc. And then you may ask your question. But also just to say that even to the last speaker immediately, I like the last point that you said about we start with national dialogue and to think about how conversation is run from that point. And I like that you mentioned the roadmap to future work, and I do have a follow-up question in that one, particularly on a suggestion that I read, and I would like to hear your insights on this, securing a safe approach to plastics, alternatives and substitutes in order to avoid regrettable consequences. and also tied to that, the place of the Science Policy Advisory Panel. So I would just like to hear your thoughts on that particular suggestion and what that looks like, even as I allow participants to, you may raise your hand or put it in the chat and just ask the question. Thanks. Sorry, you're muted. Oh, it's okay.
Janet, sorry, I missed the specifics of your question. I can't hear you too well. Something about plastic substitutes and the work program, and then I lost the rest of that.
Oh, absolutely, it's fine. Yeah. So I had a question on the roadmap to future work, from dialogue roadmap to future work, particularly on a suggestion that I read, securing a safe approach to plastics alternative and substitutes in order to avoid regrettable consequences. And also the place of the Science Policy and Advisory Panel. And I just wanted you to shed a bit more light on what this means and what it looks like, this suggestion particularly, even as I allow participants to just raise your hand and you may ask a question after this one. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think the follow-up work on the substitutes and alternatives to plastics is something that's extremely important from different perspectives. I mean, because well, a substitute or an alternative to plastic isn't necessarily good for the environment, right? So it might be better, it might not create the plastic pollution, but as long as there's no life cycle analysis, it's not that simple to say this is actually a product that will make it, you know, that's environmentally sustainable. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into that, into identifying whether a product is desirable because it doesn't have the pollution part that plastics does, and what other environmental elements there might be for which this could be an alternative to plastic that's desirable from an environmental perspective. So I think that discussion is really important. It's ongoing, and there is some work done. I came across a document somewhere with already specific non-plastic substitutes mentioned in trade-related plastic measures. And there's a whole list, including everything from, you know, lots of biomass, pineapples and wheat and banana, plantains and things like that. And I think cotton, I saw that somewhere as well. So there's a list of that. And then there is the alternatives as well that are just differently products that have basically less of an implication on the environment. But there, yeah, that's just going to be very, very technical work to identify this. And of course, everything is a trade-off. If you're going to make cotton a substitute for plastic, too much cotton growth could harm food security, right? Because it's the agriculture and there is the water that it needs, etc. So it's I think also demonstrates a bit the importance of adopting a more holistic approach, which isn't always possible, especially not in these negotiations, but the danger of pigeonholing it too much. But so this is something that will be discussed further going forward based on the work that's been done. And there, given the list that's been identified, I think a lot of these products could be areas where different African countries actually have a comparative advantage, and they might really want to leverage that.
Thank you. So I'll just scan through to see whether there is anyone who wants to make a contribution or ask a question. And even as I do that, I do have one more question for Eva and Dr. Jody. But this is also because the things that you spoke about kind of relate, which relates to fossil fuel subsidies. So I did have a question on the specific negotiations for the fossil fuel subsidies and what specifically you think, like just pointing out very specific points that you think African countries should highlight, even as the specific negotiations on fossil fuel subsidies are maybe a possibility, or as we talk about it, even in light of trade and environment, what do you think should be some of the things that are highlighted, just maybe very specifically? And then I'll just again scan to see what we have.
Sure. Shall I'll jump in then, Janet. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it, thinking ahead? Because obviously, I don't think we can wait 20 years, to address fossil fuel subsidies like we've waited for to address harmful fishing subsidies. And even then, we're not certain, whether we've got the WTO has the full number of countries to ratify. So it's clear that there's, this real sense of, like in the climate cap, there's such a sense of urgency. And then when you contrast that with the kind of wheels of multilateralism, and the way that the WTO works, it's extremely kind of painfully slow. So it is really, how to break this, like how to change these dynamics. I think we really do need to start thinking very carefully, like how to break out and how to change these dynamics. And some have said, getting other actors on board, like the OECD, and they did some great work in the past on agricultural subsidies, just taking it out of the hands of seasoned diplomats and putting it more into the hands of technocrats could be helpful. Having said that, I do think that it's the innovation, the addition of the agreement to help countries in terms of the fisheries fund. So if there is an agreement on addressing fossil fuel subsidies, how that will be, like what measure will accompany that in terms of support for adjustment, and because then you've got all of the issues around the just transition. But if we look at the fishery subsidies, it's accompanied by this other fund to help countries that have capacity constraints. So that would also be very interesting to look in terms of how that could work and what that might look like, thinking about all of these issues around the just transition. I mean, I'm always quite surprised. I was quite surprised that the just energy transition partnerships that have received so much attention at different COPs, and you've got more countries getting involved with these. I'm just always surprised that these are not really discussed within the WTO context at all. So even on this special session that I mentioned on energy transition, these sorts of partnerships were not brought into that discussion, despite there being kind of obvious trade and investment linkages there. But yeah, somehow we just need to break this sense of urgency. We need to transfer it somehow into the WTO on this issue.
Eva, you want to jump in and add something? Sure.
Yeah, and I think it's a very important question when we think about the expectations and contributions towards climate change mitigation of different countries. Having this perspective as well, I think that sometimes we find ourselves really in the situations where certain countries that have not really contributed a huge amount to the current existing problem of climate change are being expected to very quickly match the efforts that are being made, all while kind of the historical pollution issues and existing amounts of support for fossil fuels kind of being soft played. So I think from the African countries' perspective, insisting on getting more transparency on fossil fuel subsidies, at least the expenditures and the structure and the design of those programs is absolutely essential, because it will also demonstrate how much of the effort to still lock into fossil fuel dependent future is coming from which corners. I do think that there is quite a lot of perspective in African countries in the green markets of the future, in the markets that are really driven by a much cleaner mix of fuels. We know that fossil fuels will not go away in a day. It will not go in 2, and probably not in a decade and or 2 or even more. Much as we want that, there will be graduality, but we need to make sure that this transitionary period is also unlocking gains for countries that are using more solar power, more hydropower, more wind power, and that African economies can find their ways to those markets. I think it was Jody, if I remember well, who was mentioning that some of those countries are being met by unilateral measures. So making sure that the integration aspect is there, that the attempts to green those markets are also coming with necessary support and joint international cooperation that actually is more integrationist rather than fragmentationalist is particularly important. I also think that those discussions need to come with a very, very rational approach towards what is sensible, what is socially acceptable, and what makes sense for the development. We also need to be mindful about the impacts that some of those fossil fuel subsidies have for the poorest populations, and we really need to be very mindful to the designs of those measures, really making sure that we can improve if we cannot phase out immediately, really making sure that the support of the societies are really leaning towards the greening of the economies, are really leaning towards this substantial transformation of our economies. But for that, again, social sensitivity needs to be there. I'll stop here.
Janet?
Yeah, Ambassador, yes, I can see you.
No, I'm going to allow Patrick to come in because I see his hand is raised. I was just going to say that, you know, we need to be a little bit sensitive to the opposite sex, because I think gender-wise, we've done really, really well. I'm so proud of the panel, of our CEO. And so I think I'll stop there and allow Patrick to come in so that there's some little balance that is being injected into the conversation.
Patrick?
Thank you very much. It's really nice to see that the boot is on the other foot for once. You can see my background. It shows you where I'd actually like to be at this moment rather than in freezing cold Geneva. I want to ask particularly Jody a question. It has a trade aspect, but it's not necessarily absolutely central to trade. I have a sense that all this discussion, all these international discussions on climate change focus a lot on mitigation, which they need to. But if you take Africa's situation, Africa represents, in terms of its share of emissions, is less than 10%. Probably, I think I read somewhere about 7% for the entire continent of CO2 equivalent emissions. But Africa stands in the way of, is very vulnerable to the early effects of climate change, like other regions in the world. And I want to know what's going on in adaptation. I don't seem to hear a lot about it, but it may be because I'm not close enough to the discussions. But it seems to me that for the continent, adaptation, it's great in going forward to be as green as possible in terms of techniques and production and so on. But the reality is that for Africa, the real bind is going to be, is there enough adaptation taking place to deal with the consequences of global warming, which are coming faster than I think the scientists were saying in the earlier years.
Then I can see Eva, hands up, for sure.
Yeah. So maybe I should then make a short intervention to just add on to what Patrick has said, and it has a lot to do with the expectations, I think, from the rest of the world, that the developing and LDCs should come forward and if not carry exactly the same share of the burden and take the same level of responsibility, then it has to be really close to that. And the hesitation that I have seen in at least in our part of the world, which is really based on what Patrick has just said, the contribution, and then also the genesis and the earlier discussions around climate and environment, which laid down key principles. One of which was that the polluter pays, principle, which many countries refuse to give up. I'm not going to make any judgment call on it. But many countries refuse to give up that principle. I can understand why, coming from the South, and I'm sure that all of you can understand why too, because of what Patrick has said. The contribution is so far below any other region of the world, and the expectations that the burden should almost be shared equally, I think is a bit problematic for many of these countries. And if you add to that the fact that Africa and many other countries are being told to move away from the use of indigenous means of development, including fuel wood, and adapt to newer technologies, which are extremely, in fact, expensive and totally unaffordable for these countries, then you can actually understand that it's, they're actually placed between in a place that is untenable, to say the least. You really do want to support. You understand the reasons why we must all act in a certain way, and yet you do not have neither the capacity nor the skills nor the technology to actually support what your convictions, in other words, that you should be in the front line of fighting against global warming and supporting all the measures that are being proposed, because at the end of the day you actually suffer the most severe consequences as a result of what Patrick has just said, the lack of adaptation measures being in place. And so I can understand where those that want very drastic change to happen almost overnight are coming from, but it's really going to be important if we are to continue making the progress. And I can tell you that many of these countries are taking on responsibilities that are really, they're punching so way above their weight. They're taking on responsibilities they can hardly afford because they want to be on the right side of history. They want to be judged correctly, right? And so there has to be a way in which, even as we look at this whole, scenario, we have to have a way of, saying, okay, these countries that have taken these kind of measures, and whether it's plastic pollution in the countries that are in the forefront. And any of you that has traveled to Kenya will know that as you get off the plane, you're told to leave all the plastic in the airplane, right? Plastic that you've carried from Europe, essentially. So basically, these countries, in order for everybody else to be able to embrace, hopefully, these measures, would have to be rewarded in some form or shape. Now, that has not yet happened. Even with the carbon credits, there's serious issues on the costing of carbon in different parts of the world. So, for instance, if I just talked about Kenya, because that's the country that I know best. Kenya is a poster country for green energy. Right, such a huge percentage of our energy is derived from solar and wind and geothermal. Right, and yet the rewards for doing that, for running away from other sources, right, has not been obvious. It's not come through, and so other countries that are thinking geothermal are thinking, but look at Kenya, you're developing your geothermal on debt, on loans, very little grants coming through for green energy. In fact, there are more grants coming through for other forms of energy than green energy. And so the question is, how serious are we really about these discussions that we are having on climate, on global warming, on green energy, on encouraging certain behavior, on plastic pollution? If the countries that are banning plastic are basically in the south, and yet most of the talk about plastic pollution is in the north, it's happening in the north. So it's a bit confusing. I can understand where it's coming from, but it's a bit confusing, and I'd really, really appreciate, because I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to all of you. That's why I couldn't tear myself away from where I was sitting, because I've thoroughly enjoyed everything that has been said. And hopefully, just before we conclude, if I come back, then I would, because I just want to hear everybody else say something as well. We can probably also talk about the expectations for the ministerial that is coming up. Thank you.
So Dr. Jody, do I give you an opportunity to respond to both those then can you give them?
Thank you very much indeed, Excellency, and also Patrick for the very, very it's a critical issue, these issues around adaptation, and it is deeply, deeply unfair, the fact that countries are taking on mitigation measures even though their contribution is so minuscule and the resources pretty limited. We know that there's a really big gap. So I've just been kind of looking furiously at what my colleagues have been doing on this front, because they have been doing quite a lot. So my understanding is that the Paris Agreement did include a goal on global adaptation, but it was quite vague. So what they did at COP28 was to try to define it and to try and narrow down and focus on targets. So I believe that at COP28, the global goal on adaptation was reached, and this will now feature within the global stocktake exercise. And this is where countries assess the measures that they are taking in view of climate change. So there'll be specific adaptation goals in there that countries will try to meet. But obviously we still have that big issue around the finance. And there are studies by UNEP. They do have like an adaptation gap assessment by UNEP. They undertake this, and it looks at, they look at, resources going into sectors like water, sanitation, and so on. So I'm happy to put some more information in the chat on this, but I do believe that progress was made at COP28, but I do share very much your concern, in relation to the adaptation imperative. I just think around the work that we've been doing for the least developed country group, looking at the future of aid for trade, even when you look at the kind of trade diagnostic studies, like the starting point now is we've got inbuilt temperature rises, we've got inbuilt sea level rises. So, the whole diagnostics exercise need to take these starting points into account, and it's just not there. And we do have these continued shortfalls in terms of where the money is going at the moment. So it is a big, big challenge. There are a lot of people, though, that do share very much your views and concerns. So they're thinking more about, resilient value chains. I know there's some great work going on at the University of Cape Town on these sorts of issues. So having that adaptation as the starting point, and then thinking about how to develop more resilient value chains. I'm going to put some more information in the chat box as well for information.
So, Dr. Jody, okay, we'll have you. Sorry, about that. Patricia is back. Yeva, maybe you could just respond to the questions as we try and set up. Dr. Jody, thanks.
Yeah, and I cannot describe how grateful I am to Patrick for raising this issue. This is something that the International Institute for Sustainable Development cares really deeply about, and we're trying to raise a profile of the issue of trade and climate change adaptation to to an extent possible. For those of you who might be at MC13, we're going to have Trade and Sustainability Hub in the margins of that event, and we're going to be having a session on climate change adaptation and trade policy measures. But our concern stems basically from the fact that ISD is also home to the Secretariat of Global Network of National Adaptation Plans, meaning that we have by this point 52 multi-sector national adaptation plans that have been submitted to UNFCCC, out of which 21 come from Africa. And the Secretariat and the Global Network is creating the community of practice of climate change adaptation professionals that are looking through the tasks and challenges ahead via a diverse set of sectors. We are developing additional work program that is also looking into the trade policy as a support measure to actually enable those adaptation plans and help countries access the goods and services that they might be needing. And quite sadly, the problem is often not only the issue of market access or trade policies that have not been sufficiently thought through, but also the market sizes of economies who are willing to liberalize their markets, but cannot attract the likes of insurance services or financial services that could be absolutely necessary, especially when we're talking about small island developing countries. We have also seen multiple examples when different policies, including the liberalization policy, were not able to attract sufficient investments in the production or even the import of greener goods or renewable energy infrastructure. Having said that, we still think that trade has a very, very strong role to play there, as Jody has mentioned, including in the better integration of value chains, but also thinking through measures of technology transfers, especially when we're talking about new breeds of animals or new seeds of crops that will be needed to transform agriculture to that compatible with our next generation climate, if you might. We will need to think about new type of infrastructure needed for our road services, logistics services, and even the constructions. I would say, though, that sometimes this is also the issue of semantics when we look into the content of it, because both climate change mitigation experts and climate change adaptation professionals actually highlight the importance of building up the renewable energy infrastructure, be it from mitigation or from climate change adaptation perspectives. And I think that sometimes it's really important for those two communities to sit down and compare notes, just to make sure that, or rather just to realize how many overlaps there are when we're talking things really at much more detail. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much for those contributions. I'm just going to jump onto Colette now to maybe you want to say something, and then we can see whether there's another round of questions.
Thank you, Janet. And I have to apologize. I'm sitting in Geneva and my connection is very sporadic. So I have only heard about 50% of the discussion, but I think I've picked up a few things that I would like to respond to. By Ambassador Amina Mohammed, the point about the inequalities more globally and on the one hand, the need to make those changes, but perhaps not being equipped to doing so. I think that's a really valid point. And that's coming up time and again in so many different discussions on trade and climate, whether it's on carbon pricing or here on plastic waste or biodiversity issues or agriculture and the fertilizer and pesticide discussions. So I think it's really a common theme. There are no easy answers to that, of course, other than perhaps looking at ways in which some of these inequalities could be somewhat addressed. And Yeva already mentioned technology transfer, which is going to have to be absolutely critical. I mean, where we've been talking mostly about the energy discussions and things like that. But even if you talk about the circular economy, the EU is about, well, the Council and the Parliament have agreed on their eco-design for sustainable products regulation, which is going to require each product that's consumed in the EU to have a digital product passport and all kinds of other performance and sustainable eco-design parameters. A digital product passport, where is it going to come from, right? How is it going to work? What do you need for that? So this is, I think, everywhere. So technology transfer, the right types of technologies, to get this passport done, to get all the other elements done that's required. And there's some initiatives here, and I think they go, yes, there's the TRIPS agreement at the WTO, but that might not have sufficient impetus to actually get countries to transfer critical technologies. Although there are some members that have said, could we do something that happened to public health for critical health-related medications and things like that? Could we have an amendment to TRIPS focused on critical goods for the green transition, right? Could that make a difference? I mean, there are, I think, some elements to perhaps address this specifically in some committees, but then you're going to have very difficult discussions on what kind of goods will that mean, and you know, it might not be easy to agree on that. But then I think more globally, the financing element that Jody already spoke about, and the gap of financing we have right now, both in terms of what's pledged by different countries to support the developing countries and vulnerable countries, but also in terms of private finance. The cost of borrowing in many African countries is a lot higher than the cost of borrowing, say, in Europe or in the US. And so that discrepancy needs to be addressed as well. And that must be done outside of the WTO by different mechanisms. And I think here the international development banks can play a big role. Avinat Persaud has done some, they have the Bridgetown initiatives in the Caribbean, which I think is doing very interesting work on trying to rethink some of these financial elements in the green transition. And that might be something that could be expanded or taken up. But yeah, those are just some ideas. But there's no easy solutions to this. But ultimately, I think tech transfer and the financing element and countries actually delivering that, and perhaps related to that, the specific partnerships. If we're talking about really specific funding directed to a need identified by a country, by say an African country, saying we have potential to set up renewable industry X here, we need this, we need that, and we need that, we need this amount of money, give it to us, right? Something very concrete and specific that the financing can come to addressing some of these gaps. But I think ultimately, well, my hope is that we can create win-wins where there might not be a reward or a financial reward for a country like Kenya that's done an amazing job on the ban of single-use plastic. But could there be an economic award and an environmental award for Kenya in a more organic way, because it might lead to a more investment coming in, or it will lead to having a cleaner environment? So is there a way that the rewards can come in a slightly different way, as well as perhaps other ways in which we could think about? But yeah, it's a key question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colette, even for this being very specific to the gaps and breaking it down, and to all the panelists for their very specific points, adaptation and financing, all very difficult conversations, but thought-provoking. I'm hoping we left with a lot of thoughts and insights on the subject matter. In view of time, I'm sure you'll have so many questions. There's only so much you can do. 1.5 hours, but at least we have done our part in terms of provoking some thought into the subject matter. I'll call upon our founder, Ambassador Amina Mohammed, to maybe make a few closing remarks, at which point we can stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Janet. I know that the participants would like to have this conversation continue, but we are also aware that we requested a specific period of time from our panelists, and we know they have so much more important work that they need to get to. And so let me begin by just expressing our gratitude, I think, all of us, to Dr. Jody, to Colette, and to Eva, for really an amazing insight into the latest developments in all the areas that have been covered. So thank you very, very, very much. I think that one of the biggest contributions that we've had today is just the figures and the statistics that you provided, but also all the argumentation on behalf of everything that is important to all of us, whether it's multilateral trade, climate change, plastic pollution, or the fossil fuel debate. All those issues are critically important. They are priorities, by the way, for African countries, each and every one of them, and all of them, together. And that's why we were all hoping that the forthcoming, ministerial in Abu Dhabi would answer some of the questions that were so critical. We were happy with COP28 to a certain degree, and I think Jody, you've pointed to some of the gains that were made during COP28. I spent a little bit of time there, and I was also, quite impressed with some of the steps that were taken. Obviously, not enough done, as usual, because of the challenges and the difficulties of the conversations that need to be had. But I was really looking forward to MC13 actually delivering on fisheries, moving to the next phase on the digital economy, and making sure that we actually do not take a step backwards. Because one of the reasons why the framework was left as it was because it allowed many of our countries to actually use that marketplace to sell their products without having to spend a lot of money on marketing, on presence, on physical presence in countries and in regions. And we hope that won't take a step backwards where we introduce barriers for some of the very, very small and medium-sized enterprises in our countries to access more developed markets. So I'm hoping that will not happen at MC13, but also in agriculture. We're looking forward to getting some progress made. I think there's a lot of work that's ongoing, and I think like everybody else, I'm hoping that sleeves will be rolled up and midnight oil will be burnt, and that finally we'll have some really critical and concrete outcomes at MC 13, because we always remain hopeful. Sometimes you have the biggest storms just before you get reprieve. So we're all looking forward to that. But I agree with everything that was said, that in terms of fuel, in terms of fossil fuels, transparency is really going to be key for us to actually just know what is going on and what is important. Identifying priorities, our own priorities, but also global priorities, because there has to be some level of alignment. Otherwise it's difficult to talk to each other. And so one has to always be cognizant of what the priorities, the global priorities that we have all agreed to certain levels, some more than others, but we've all agreed to having this as global priorities. And we should all be working very, very closely together, very cooperatively, in partnership, to make sure that we deliver on them. And again, obviously with the right kind of safeguards, with the support that is promised and must be given to developing countries and all the other issues that we all discussed today. But I just want to end again by saying that really, really grateful. Thank you very much for putting in so much work into this and for your availability. We will be calling on you again and again because we share such common interests in all this, in all the issues that we are discussing. So please don't get tired of us knocking your doors and asking you to participate. And please let us know when it's more convenient than other times, for you to come on board. But also, just to say that we're also available. Whenever you want us to be supportive of you, we will be available. We have a wonderful team of advisors on TNIF's board, and so call on us as well. Let me thank our CEO, Janet Macharia, for doing such an amazing job. Thank all the members of the advisory board that are with us here today, including, of course, Patrick Law. I want to thank a very dear friend of mine from Kosovo, who invited and was very, very happy to come on board. Alush, thank you very much for coming in and listening to us. And hopefully you will be our next panelist for the next webinar that we have. But really, thank you very, very much to all the panelists, to the participants, to our CEO, to everybody who has joined us online. And I'd like now to hand over to Janet so that she can bring this to a close.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, everyone. And yeah, without wasting much time, I want to wish you all good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And we look forward to linking again and again and to consistently further this conversation for a better future. So thank you so much.
Oh, Janet, I can see Alan. Alan is there. Alan Wolf. Alan, hi. Very nice to see you. Very nice to see you. I'm sure everybody is happy to see you. And thank you again for the book. It's an amazing book. And all of us are benefiting tremendously from just reading it and having it as part of our reference material. Thank you. You're muted, Alan. You're muted.
Thank you, and thank you to all the excellent discussants this morning for a very great session.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And again, to the panelists, thank you for everything.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a nice
everyone.
afternoon.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Excellency. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Janet, thank you.